last lecture, and it's a relatively short one, and it's just a review of all of the things that we've covered so far in lecture. And I've tried to analogize the study of natural history or ecology and evolution of New Zealand's flora and fauna. It's a bit like being a crime scene investigator, that what you're left with after hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and ecological interaction, you've left with the consequence, and trying to figure out what processes may have driven that consequence, those patterns that you see in New Zealand trees, is your job as a natural historian. So it's not all that much different than a crime scene investigator. The first plant that we talked about was Pseudopanus crassifolius, one of the world's most unusual plants, and we talked about its flowers, and specifically the fact that they're dioecious, so individuals are either male or female. Then we talked about its fruits, specifically the amount of pulp that are on the fruit, relative to the size of seeds, the size of the seed coat, or the thickness of the seed coat, relative to the size of the embryo, and how these things influence dispersal, and how they influence parasitism by seed parasites like weevils. Or seed predators, I should say, like weevils. And then we talked about the juveniles of Pseudopanus crassifolius, which is probably its most unusual feature, their color and their size and their shape, and the fact that they change completely in morphology once they grow to be adults. Next up was Carpodetta serratus, and we didn't talk so much about its flowers or its fruits, because we had talked about those two structures previously in Pseudopanus crassifolius, but we did talk about its juvenile form, which is very different than Pseudopanus crassifolius. It has a divaricate branching habit. And then we talked about two features of adult plants. One is that the leaves have structures on their undersides called domatia, and the fact that adults are riddled with holes that are the result of parasitism by a magnificently large moth species. And last week we talked about Metrosideros robusta, or strangling rata. We talked about its flowers, and also about the transition between juveniles and adults and its strange life history, where it starts out up high, grows down low, and then eventually takes over its host. So just to be a little bit more specific, these are female flowers and these are male flowers of Pseudopanus crassifolius. They're dioecious, so separate sexes. The incidence of dioecy is high in New Zealand, but that's just a passive byproduct, I think, of the fact that because female plants in dioecious species can be assured that they're outcrossed, they invest more in each individual seed, making them bigger. Bigger seeds are more likely to be dispersed by animals than they are by air currents, and that's why bigger seeds are more prevalent in fleshy fruits in wetter environments, because in wetter environments aerodynamic seeds or fruits don't work as well. So I think the fact that dioecy is really common in New Zealand is a passive byproduct of flow-on effects from outcrossing to seed size, and because bigger seeds are more likely to be dispersed by fleshy fruits, which are more common in wetter areas, New Zealand passively gains a large number of dioecious species. Metrosideros robusta's flowers are pretty unique. They're not red and tubular and long like bird-pollinated flowers are elsewhere. I think because our birds aren't like sunbirds or hummingbirds, in that they're small and have really long, thin, sometimes down-curved bills that fit inside long tubular flowers. We have larger birds, and the defining characteristic of bird-dispersed flowers is the length of the filament, attaching the anthers, which contain pollen, to the nectary below, just so long as they're big enough to rub the pollen off on birds' feathers, not their bills, makes flowers bird-pollinated in New Zealand. Next up to the next life history stage, fruits. And first we talked about the ratio of the amount of pulp to the amount of seed inside fruits, and it seems as though fleshy fruited species pay for the transport in seeds in proportion to how many seeds are being transported. So the size of seeds is correlated with the size of, or the amount of fruit pulp reward, which makes sense. And seed coat thickness is correlated with the size of the embryo inside. And that also makes sense in terms of the plant's proportional investment in defense relative to the size of the embryo that's being dispersed. But oddly enough, that the size of the seed coat doesn't necessarily predict predation or parasitism by weevils, which this mother weevil drills through the fruit pulp into the seed, lays her eggs inside the seed. The seed is then consumed by the juvenile weevil. Oftentimes, the fruits are swallowed by birds anyway and pass out the other end, and the baby weevil inside the seed is just fine because the hole that the mother drilled into the seed has been covered up. So really an unusual interaction. So lots of stuff going on with fruits and seeds, some of which is adaptively intuitive, and other bits like predation with weevils less so. Something else must be driving variability in weevil seed predation rates. Next up, probably the most unusual characteristic of the New Zealand flora is the really high incidence of unusual morphology, particularly in juvenile stages. This is illustrated by Pseudopanax crassifolius really fantastically, that the really small individuals are brown, which tends to match the color of leaf litter below, making them difficult for birds to see. So perhaps this form has evolved in relation to moa browsing, and a similar explanation could be levied at the juveniles or the saplings. Once they grow away from the predictable visual background of leaf litter, they become armed, as botanists would say. You know, they've got spines, lateral leaf spines along the margins of leaves, and they're advertised, or they're made more conspicuous by flecks of lighter colored tissue that always flank the spines. So these leaves probably were more difficult, or probably difficult for any leaf-swallowing bird to consume, and those spines would have made it more difficult, I would think. Next, a really defining characteristic of the New Zealand flora. This is actually a picture that comes from John Dawson's book, Forest Finds to Snow Tussocks, which John Dawson used to teach Biology 219, and this was his lecture notes. So it's fitting, I think, we put one of his slides in. This is a range of divaricate plant species in New Zealand, and it's been a long-standing argument in the literature about what causes divaricate branching. Some people think environment, other people think it has something to do with slowing down moa herbivory, making it more difficult or energetically costly for a bird to make a living consuming leaves attached to divaricately branched juvenile plants. And one bit of evidence that seems to lean in the moa hypothesis favor is that divaricately branched species in New Zealand, after they colonize the Chatham Islands, lose their divaricate growth form, perhaps as a consequence of moa not being on the Chatham Islands. Then we talked about several features of adult plants. This is an incredibly interesting and unusual way of making a living. It's a lepidopteran larvae, the Puriri moth, burrows inside host trees. It lives there for a really long time, years and years, up to 6 or 7 years. Then it emerges and spends its final 2 days of life as a butterfly, or sorry, as a moth, rather than feeding behind this camouflaged webbing in host trees that it. And this is one that's been abandoned, and there's lots of tree species in New Zealand. And I think it's best exemplified by Carpodetta serratus, that's heavily attacked by Puriri moth and forever looks as though it's been attacked. So when we walk through the bush and see a tree full of holes, it's an artifact of interactions, parasitic interactions with a really magnificent, huge moth. Another adult attribute that we talked about were leaf domatia. This is a great example. This is actually a cross-section of Hinau, or Eliocarpus dentatus. It has a tent-shaped domatia, which seems to provide housing for mites, one of which is right there. which probably protect the leaf against fungal attacks. So this seems to be a mutualism a lot like ants and acacias, where acacias provide shelter for ants that in turn protect the plant. There's a picture of the leaf domatia, which are more pit-like and have trichomes in Carpodetta serrata, so there's several different forms of domatia, but functionally they seem to be marching to the same drummer, doing the same thing, providing homes for mites that consume pathogenic fungi. There he is. The last attribute of adult plants that seems to be a characteristic of the New Zealand flora, but not of north temperate forests, is this really high incidence of an epiphytic lifestyle, or arboreal plants. Some canopy emergent tree species start out as epiphytes, growing on the branches of other plants, sending roots down, eventually girdling them, and what's left is just these bits of bark of the host tree that is rotting away, and strangling rota is left behind as a healthy, mature, adult individual, but it's the strange trunk morphology is an artifact of its juvenile life as a hemiepiphyte. Another type of arboreal plant that we talked about were mistletoes. There's one right there. This is a viscaceous mistletoe that evolved in the northern hemisphere, or the group Viscaceae evolved in the northern hemisphere. We also have a large number of Laurantheus mistletoes, which are much more showy and have broader leaves. So mistletoes, which are parasites, parasitic arboreal plants, are very common in New Zealand. There's another one back there. This one lives its life on the tips of branches and doesn't take over the host plant. It just steals water and nutrients from it to make a living. Right, so hopefully I've been able to convince you that a lot of the features of the New Zealand bush can be made sense of in terms of species interactions, predation, competition, commensalism, parasitism, mutualism. Well, maybe not so much commensalism, because that's an interaction between two species where not a lot is happening, right, in terms of effects on both species 1 and species 2. Yeah, so species interactions can have a huge effect on the flora and fauna of pretty much anywhere, and especially New Zealand. There's some great examples of things that you can see in the bush that you can track back to specific interactions with animals or other plants. I also hope that I've impressed upon you as well that sometimes attributes of the New Zealand flora and fauna and other places on Earth can be the result of accidents, passive byproducts of other processes going on, like the high incidence of diaceae in New Zealand. Okay, that's it. I will see you in the field